Hey everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and today I have a special treat for you. My friend Daylan Woodall joins us. Daylan, hello.
Hey, Matt. How's it going?
Things are super. You are in sunny northern Alabama right now, correct?
I am in sunny northern Alabama, very sunny Alabama, Alabama that feels a little bit like the surface of the sun itself, as a matter of fact.
I'm so sorry to hear that. We had 106 this week, man. It's pretty legit for where I live.
I don't want to give you temperature envy, but we had a heat index of 107 today.
Gross.
Yeah.
Northern Alabama, that's the home of the Decatur First Missionary Baptist Church. Is that correct?
It is First Missionary Baptist Decatur on the corner of Vine and Grove Street in Decatur, Alabama. Our oldest member, Miss Etta Freeman, turned 104 years old this week.
When was that church started?
It was started right after the Civil War by 21 former slaves in the home of Miss Jane Young.
Do you know how I knew that church was there in northern Alabama?
However did you know?
It's because of that time that you and I talked about it, and we did videos together about it because it's such an interesting church. You're such an interesting guy. And for the longest time, I keep telling you every time we talk and catch up, dude, like, come on here and talk about Matthew with me because I want the people who I hang out with on the podcast to get to know you better. And so thank you for jumping in to process Matthew 19, my friend.
I'm thrilled. I had a great time when you came to visit the church, and honored to be a friend and thrilled to be on the podcast.
Likewise, amigo. So here's the deal. We just got to the part with the super famous verse where Jesus is like, hey, it's going to be easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And we debunked the two things that you often hear repeated. One is the linguistic thing, like, oh, no, what Jesus meant was a thick rope, and he just meant it's like inconvenient, and the stuff sort of gets in the way. And we debunked the eye of the needle gate thing, which isn't a thing. And what we're left with is this kind of weird hollow feeling coming out of Matthew 19:29, where anybody who was there, I think especially a disciple, would be kind of discouraged because it's like that kid, that rich young ruler, that is our A game. That is the very, very best look in terms of resume and personal presentation and exemplary behavior that we could trot out before Jesus to justify our admission to this kingdom that he's describing. And that guy just walked away sad. And so it would seem like the natural follow-up question would be, like, what the heck then? Who on earth could possibly accomplish this thing? There was a big kid that moved into town, I think it was in 6th grade, and he, like, just nobody could take him at sports or wrestling or fighting on the playground or anything. And finally, our 6th grade champion, I think his name was Larry, went and fought this dude, and the new kid from out of town just walloped him. And all of us were like, if he could take Larry, no one can take new kid.
Things have changed.
This is the new pinnacle. Things have changed. Not for me. My place on the pecking order was still number 33, and we only had a class of 32, so it was pretty tough. Like, the lunch lady was ahead of me. I was a late bloomer. I got around to it, man.
Can't sleep on the lunch lady, man.
No, you cannot. And so the disciples are feeling the same emotion, and the verse goes like this, Matthew 19:25. When the disciples heard this, they were greatly astonished and asked, who then can be saved? And Jesus looked at him and said, with man, this is impossible, but with God, all things are possible. What do you think the equation is that Jesus is trying to explain to his disciples here about how someone ends up being a family member of this new family of faith, a member of the kingdom of heaven, a son, a daughter, an heir, an agent of the king? What is he trying to explain to them about how you get in?
I think what he's explaining to them and what he's explaining to us is that being an authentic disciple requires complete change. The disciples have sacrificed a great deal in their efforts to follow him. They've left a great deal behind, and we'll talk about that a bit more, I'm sure, in their efforts to follow him. But it's a totalizing change. It's not just a change of what you're doing. It's not just a change of your vocation. It's not just a change of how you spend your time, but it's a radical change. It's a rebirth of who you are. And when he says, with man, this is impossible. With man being an authentic disciple, a true disciple is impossible. There's always something in the way for man. Man's perspective, man's ego, man's view and vision of himself, man's own ambition. But with God, all things are possible. So I think he's showing them and sharing with them the depth and the degree to which they have to be changed and transformed in order to be authentic disciples. And the experience that they've just had with the rich young ruler is really brought it into full focus.
If I'm the disciples, or I'm somebody sitting here listening to this conversation right now, or if I'm me, I think the natural follow-up question here is, can I do the things that need to be done to carry out this radical change you're describing through volition? Can I add up what Jesus is saying about the kingdom and be like, all right, I get it. It's not that I bring a fancy resume or all of this. I have to be super humble. So I choose to be super humble. I'm going to sell my stuff. I'm going to part ways with the things that are my identity. And now I am going to do what I am supposed to do. Or is this passage suggesting that God has to make the first move?
I think this passage is suggesting that God has to make the first move. And if you'll permit me to say something a little cheesy, I think it is that our Christianity can't have a capital letter I in it. I think as you were sort of supposing that hypothetical to me, you rightly touched upon what oftentimes I think stands in the way of our growth and our development as serious and authentic Christian disciples, and that is this thinking and this thought that it's something that we do. If I can just do that, if I can just do this, if I can just do more of that, if I can just do less of this. And it's God's work in us and through us. It is our yielding and submitting. It is our pivoting away from ourselves and our ambitions and even our own abilities and even our own thinking and our own thought about our own ability and our own worth and our own work, and an acceptance of the fact that it is the work of God through us with man and by man alone. Jesus says this is impossible, but with God and by God alone, it is possible. So it's a referendum, and it's an examination on how much of our Christianity is because of our own capability, and none of our Christianity, none of our authentic discipleship, none of the things that we do that pleases God is because we did it without God himself.
I'm not asking performatively for the benefit of people listening in. I'm asking because I think it's a legitimate question, and I want to know your take on it. And maybe it's semantic, but I'm very curious about this order of operations here. I remember when you learned how the math worked, and you run into a big equation with all kinds of division and multiplication.
I still have nightmares
about
it.
Do you remember the order of operations acrostic? Do you remember that?
Absolutely. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally is what we learned in my...
That's exactly the same one I use, yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard different ones.
Sure.
But yeah, it's
well,
the order
other
of operations.
ones are wrong, Matt. I'm sorry.
Golly, I like you, especially when you agree with me. So what is the order of operations for a person who's outside of the new family of faith, outside of the kingdom, but they see how Jesus is, and they read the stuff about how Jesus is, and they see that he breaks the laws of time and space, and they're like, all right, that checks out. I think that seems pretty legitimate. I'm at the rich young ruler point in the equation, and I'm going to walk up and say, I would like to join. If you get to a place where you would say, I would like to join, does that mean that this thing we're reading in verse 26 has already happened? That the impossible thing that God does that humans can't do has already happened because you want that? Or is it possible to be like the rich young ruler and be like, I want to initiate the conversation. I see the value in this. It looks like it has incredible value. I would like to sign up. But he's unwilling to do the things that need to be done. Do you see what I'm driving at?
I do. I think coming to that point, coming to that awareness, having what one biographer says, our heart strangely warmed, is the beginning. It's the beginning of that impossible process starting to happen. But it takes a continual renewal. It takes a continual submitting. It takes a continual willingness to sacrifice. And the rich young ruler is willing up into a point, and an authentic disciple is permanently willing. The rich young ruler is willing to go and willing to begin the conversation and willing to hear the response of Christ. But there is a point at which he stops being willing. There's a point at which he does this calculation and ultimately determines that the cost of following Christ is greater. He makes an economic calculus at the cost of following Christ, not only financially, but in terms of his life and his living. The cost of following Christ is too great a cost. And an authentic disciple never arrives at that place where it's too great a cost. We might come to the place of realizing that it is a great cost, because it is a great cost. It's a cost of dying to self. It's a cost of changing completely.
I knew you have good thoughts on this. Hey, Daylan, I think we've got a long ways to go before we unpack everything that we're wanting to talk about here. Are you cool with hanging on for a second conversation's worth of time here with me?
Yeah, sure. I'm up for it. Let's do it.
We're just going to hit pause there. Everybody who's listened for any amount of time, you know we do this from time to time. We get going on something that we don't want to break the mood, and so we're just going to pick it up next episode right where we left off with my buddy Daylan Woodall, pastor of the First Missionary Baptist Church of Decatur, Alabama, talking about this incredibly difficult equation we've been working on in Matthew 19 about how the kingdom happens. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.